Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast, brought to you by Solace Global. In this edition of Regional Flashpoints, our intelligence team looks at growing unrest in France, a planned anti-immigration protest in London, and the security risks surrounding upcoming elections in Syria. We also explore renewed military pressure in Ukraine, shifting counter-terrorism policy in Colombia, and public health-driven instability in Botswana. Let's begin with the key events shaping the current risk landscape.
I've selected 3 upcoming events or important dates that are likely to affect international politics and security in the coming weeks. Firstly, we have not a set date, but rather a very likely crisis that will happen in France on the 8th of September. That is the day where the Bayrou government has called for a confidence vote, which is highly likely not to pass after the far-right National Rally has pledged not to support the government in an important U-turn. If the Bayrou government were to fall, it would be the second government supported by President Macron to fall in little more than a year. This would almost certainly result in Macron being put under significant pressure to call new elections. However, with the political situation and political equilibrium in France not having shifted that much, the new elections are likely to result in a hung parliament similar to the one that we have today. This is going to continue to precipitate France's ongoing political crisis, and is likely to drive even further unrest spearheaded by the left and the right. The political situation in France remains highly unstable, with the options that the Macron government has remaining equally unpopular. The second date I've selected is the 13th of September. On this date, there is a large-scale anti-immigration protest being planned in the centre of London. The protest is planned by several right-wing and far-right political influencers and political figures in the United Kingdom, as well as several international political figures from the right. The protest is likely to draw large crowds in central London, including large groups of counter-protesters. There are, of course, several anti-immigration protests going on in the United Kingdom at this moment, including at hotels housing asylum seekers. The protest is likely to continue to drive pressures on the Starmer government, and it will likely continue to drive civil unrest in the short term. The final date that I've selected is between the 15th and 20th of September. This is when Syria will hold its first parliamentary elections since the fall of the Assad regime in December 2024. The elections will appoint 2/3 of the members of the People's Assembly, which is the newly formed parliament of Syria. The remaining 1/3 will be nominated by the president of Syria, al-Shara. The elections are likely to be marked by severe security threats. This will both include the ongoing remnants of the civil war, with civil strife being recorded in multiple places across Syria, and also due to the ongoing threat of terrorism, with a possibly resurgent Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, likely to carry out attacks to destabilize the government. Now, the interim government of Syria has postponed elections in the Suwaida area and in the northeast regions, which are predominantly Kurdish, due to the risk of armed conflict. However, other parts of Syria, including the coastal areas of the Mediterranean and Damascus, will hold a vote, meaning that there is still going to be severe security threats. As shown by the recent attacks on Christian places of worship and other minority communities, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria is looking for more opportunities to destabilize the al-Shara government and also to recruit into its ranks disillusioned fighters who joined the government and are now disappointed with the direction that he has taken by calling new votes. There is a high likelihood that possible terrorist attack will target minority communities and also international citizens in Syria.
Now we move to Ukraine, where recent escalations in long-range strikes signal a renewed intensity in the conflict and growing pressure on Russia's war economy.
Russian strikes against Ukrainian urban centres have resumed in intensity over the past 2 weeks, following a brief lull in relative intensity following the build-up to the Alaska summit between US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Overnight on the 20th to 21st of August, there were mass long-range layered aerial strikes against Ukrainian urban centres, and overnight 27th to 28th of August, there was a significant attack against Kyiv, which left at least 23 people dead. It is likely that the Kremlin, in an attempt to ward off US pressure given the diplomatic engagements, had a brief reduction in the intensity of long-range strikes. Russian long-range strikes against Ukrainian urban centres dramatically escalated since May, and in the summer, on a week-to-week basis, records were broken on the scale of Russian long-range strikes. This likely emphasises the current threat profile in Ukrainian cities as the highest since the initial stages of the full-scale invasion. Moreover, Ukraine's aerial campaign against Russian targets has, however, progressed. For example, it is estimated now at least 17% of Russia's total refining capacity has been at least partially disrupted, with at least 10 oil refineries having been hit by Ukrainian long-range drones. And the success of the long-range campaign by Ukraine occurs as Ukraine is further bolstering its aerial threat. This has included the unveiling of a new domestically built cruise missile, which has been called the Flamingo. However, in the past few days, there have been concerns regarding the company making it due to a corruption investigation. It is likely that Kyiv is highly incentivized to have a domestically produced long-range missile threat against Russia, due to the Pentagon having blocked the use of their Army Tactical Missile Systems, or ATACMS, to strike targets inside internationally recognized Russian territory. The Ukrainian aerial campaign is having a strategic level impact on the Russian war economy, or at least this is likely, with the Russian war economy being a key center of gravity for the war effort. This is because Moscow's greatest advantage on the battlefield has been its manpower, with the Kremlin able to not only sustain but extensively grow its manpower without having to resort to politically costly mass conscription. And that has almost certainly been achieved with the highly considerable financial incentives offered to recruits. So whilst the Russian economy has suffered from international sanctions, it's managed to withstand a strategically decisive impact on the war effort because of these financial incentives, in order to offer these financial incentives due to, in particular, relationships with key partners such as China and India. A key source of revenue for Moscow has been its oil exports, and we're already seeing, due to the success of Ukrainian strikes against Russian oil refining capacity, some types of gasoline have increased in price by up to 38 and 49%. It is likely that the Ukrainian campaign will expand as it develops further its long-range strike capability.
Next, we turn to Colombia. Following a spate of deadly attacks, the government is shifting its security strategy, reclassifying armed groups and preparing for a new wave of counter-terrorism operations.
On the 24th of August, we observed twin attacks in Colombia. There was a truck-borne IED outside the Marco Fidel Suarez Military Aviation School in a fairly central area of Cali, Colombia's third largest city, which killed 6 people and injured over 60 people, all of which are civilians. And earlier in the day, a police helicopter was downed by a combination of small arm fires and drones, killing all 13 officers aboard, and this happened in the northern Antioquia region. In addition to the Cali truck bomb, a second IED in Cali reportedly failed to detonate and was recovered by the authorities. These attacks have been linked to separate factions of FARC's Estado Mayor Central, the EMC. Cali bombing was tied to Ivan Mordisco's EMC faction. However, the attack in Antioquia has been attributed to a different EMC cell. EMC now fundamentally operates as a semi-autonomous faction since the collapse of the 2016 peace deal, and its actions are becoming much harder to predict due to this decentralised nature in its structure. Now, the government has responded quite harshly. President Petro, who has long championed a policy of total peace, which involves dialogue and ceasefires over more military actions, has instigated a major shift. He has moved towards a more robust counter-terrorism approach and has labelled several of the armed factions within Colombia namely the EMC, the Segundo Marquetalia and the Clan del Golfo, to be designated as terrorist organisations. The Defence Minister Sanchez has also announced that Colombia will be launching Operation Sultana, which will involve elements of Search Block, which is a police special operations unit which was initially stood up to hunt high-profile cartel members like Pablo Escobar, will now be deployed to Cali. This attack in Cali follows a spate of attacks in June in the wider Cali area, although the majority of these were in municipal rural areas where armed groups have more influence. This most recent attack is the deadliest urban incident to take place since hostilities intensified in early 2025, and most importantly, the most central attack in Colombia's urban areas. Not only does this attack demonstrate the armed group's ability to strike high-value targets in central urban areas, but also its willingness to do so and to accept a high degree of civilian casualties. Most importantly, Petro's designation of these groups as terrorist organisation marks a decisive and strategic shift, largely aimed at delegitimizing armed groups as political actors, but will also entail an increase in Colombians' counter-terrorism operations. These operations are almost certainly to be focused on the killing and capturing of leadership, such as Ivan Morisco, but with this comes several increased risks. These armed groups remain fragmented, decentralised and well embedded in rural communities. They're highly resilient to conventional operation, and this fragmentation will also severely undermine any prospect for renewed dialogue or enforceable peace deals. Most importantly, armed groups are likely to escalate their attacks on military and police targets, but also we're likely to see an expansion of violence in Colombia's urban areas. Currently not assessed, there's no immediate threat to Bogota due to the logistical constraints and robust counter-terrorism and surveillance operations in the capital city, and most of the violence is concentrated in the southwest and parts of Antioquia where EMC is most active. We also assess there'll be a high threat of retaliatory violence in case any of the government's operations designed at killing or capturing high-value leadership are successful. During previous cycles of hostilities throughout Colombia, there have been high civilian casualties, and the groups have previously also targeted non-military targets such as shopping centres, bars, transport hubs and public events. And this most recent attack in Cali almost certainly underscores the willingness for EMC to accept a high degree of civilian casualties.
We finish in Botswana, where a nationwide public health emergency has exposed structural vulnerabilities in the healthcare system and raised concerns over potential unrest and rising anti-government sentiment.
On the 25th of August, President Duma Boko of Botswana declared a nationwide public health emergency during a televised address to the nation. President Boko asserted that the national medical supply chain had failed, leaving hospitals and clinics short of several medicines and also other medical equipment. 250 million Botswana Pula Emergency Fund, or approximately $18.5 million, has been secured to help address this issue, and the distribution of medicine will be undertaken by the military to the most critical rural areas. This follows on the 4th of August, the Ministry of Health suspending non-urgent procedures due to critical shortages, with the drugs most effective being those for hypertension, diabetes, cancer drugs, asthma, eye care, and perhaps most critically, sexual and reproductive health in a country that has HIV rates of around 20%. Now, the President has blamed the Central Medical Store, which is responsible for facilitating the supply chain, for inflating drug prices, which are assessed to be about 5 to 10 times the market rate. The real issue here is that Botswana is heavily dependent on the diamond market. In 2024, it was estimated that diamonds accounted for 25% of Botswana's GDP, 33% of government revenue, and around 80% of all of the country's exports. A major downturn in the global diamond market is severely limiting state revenues and limiting funding for public health initiatives. These health initiatives have historically been subsidised by diamond revenues, providing low cost or free healthcare for almost all of Botswana's citizens. Now, this emergency funding is unlikely to resolve any of Botswana's structural vulnerabilities, as this is not a short-term logistical constraint. These are wider issues with procurement and an over-reliance on diamonds. and of course the recent reduction in international aid. This public health emergency is likely to persist with chronic shortages for quite some time. Even minor operations may require being medically evacuated to South Africa or other countries. As a result of this public health emergency and critical losses in medicine, we expect it to be a heightened risk of non-communicable and infectious diseases, and this threatens repealing some of the success Botswana has made, particularly in regards to HIV and AIDS, where it's drastically cut down the rate of infection. UNICEF is also already warning of increased malnutrition among children, and the prolonged shortages risk overwhelming the healthcare system and in the long term potentially sparking public unrest or at least anti-government sentiment. There is also a realistic possibility of increased anti-US sentiment in the country following the decision to repeal US AID, even though this accounts for only a small portion of Botswana's overall medical funding. The worst case scenario, should this exist for quite some time, we could start to see demonstrations but also robberies of pharmacies, clinics and medical warehouses, and potentially attack on healthcare workers.
That concludes this episode of Regional Flashpoints on the Global Risk Podcast. These updates form part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solisglobal.com. Thank you for listening.